Okay, so this is History of the Middle East with Dr. Brovkin, and today's topic is Caliph Mumun, the continuation of a discussion of the Golden Age of Islam. So very briefly, to repeat what we've done so far, Mamun is the son of Harun Rashid, and the glorious century of the Golden Age of Islam starts with Harun Rashid. And it continues under Mamun and then continues after that as well. So this is the 9th century, the 8th and the 9th century, probably the most glorious period of all in this in the Golden Age of Islam. So let's focus specifically on what Mamun did, his personality, his policies, his achievements, what happened in the Abbasid Caliphate during this time, the history of Baghdad. All these topics need to be covered. But first, about the very beginning. So Mamun was the younger brother, and his older brother was Al Amin. And the older brother was supposed to have inherited the throne. But here again, just like in the preceding generation, there was an agreement reached between the two brothers during the lifetime of Harun Rashid. And the agreement was that the older brother, Al Amin, will become Caliph. But the junior brother, Mamun, would get to be a governor or would govern the territories east of Euphrates River. So pretty much Persia. That was the agreement, and they swore, both of them, that they would respect this agreement, and that they swore on the Quran that is the agreement sealed between the two sons and the father, that this is what's going to happen. So in 809, Harun died, and at the age of 45, so he's still a relatively young man, and you know the whole story preceding his death is the love story and the jealousy and the revenge and the execution of his nephews. In any case, he dies, and what happened in the previous generation goes again into the same scenario, which is the two brothers break the agreement and begin to fight. Basically, it's not clear who actually started the fight, but Mamun goes to war against Amin. Amin is in Baghdad, and Mamun is somewhere out there in Persia, and he brings an army, and there is a real civil war to a point of besieging Baghdad, of actually almost destroying it in the process in the year 815. In the end, Mamun wins, and Amin is defeated, and this is a kind of a new tradition, which is not that much new, but in any case, Amin's head is chopped off and delivered on the... Now we turn to the reign of Mamun, and Mamun is probably just as great as his father Harun Rashid. This is the flowering, the highest point of the Golden Age. Everything goes on pretty much as it was. He used to have a splendid court in Baghdad. Mamun, just as his father, loves poetry. He loves sciences. He's patronizing the arts. He surrounds himself with a constellation of scientists and philosophers and doctors. Of course, the House of Wisdom is there. The translations are there, and of course he actually enjoys talking and discussing issues. So he's one of those caliphs who loves intellectual discourse. He is not a warrior necessarily. He loves poetry. He writes poetry. He likes music. So let me read you a passage describing his an evening of his court. Al Mamun used to hold salon every Tuesday for the discussion of questions in theology and law. The learned men of diverse sects were shown into the chamber spread with carpets. Tables were brought in laden with food and drink. When the ripa, which is food, was finished, servants fetched braziers of incense, and guests perfumed themselves so that they were admitted to the Caliph. He would debate with them in a manner as fair and impartial, and as unlike the haughtiness of the monarch as can be imagined. At sunset, a second meal was served, and the guests departed to their homes. So what this basically shows is that he did not want to have a kind of a court atmosphere as Byzantine emperors or as future caliphs in Fatimid, Fatimid caliphs who didn't even want to be seen. They didn't even want to be, they considered beneath themselves to be in the company with other men. Their heads were covered, nobody could see them, nobody could approach them. You could approach them only on your knees, all kinds of stuff. No, he loved human company. He wanted to discuss issues with the great philosophers. This was the time when indeed there were I want to read you the names of the great philosophers who lived at this time. Yes, this is all in this age, a little bit later, but it shows you that the golden age continues. So slightly after that, but still in that age, is Al-Batani, who was an astronomer. Tabari, who was a great philosopher. Al-Razi is one of the greatest doctors and authors on medicine. Al-Farabi, that we've heard, is the chemist and the doctor and the philosopher. Al-Hazan in mathematics. Biruni in mathematics and physics. So this is the brilliant constellation of the people who translated works in the House of Wisdom, who gathered in the court for these soirees or these evenings to discuss matters of interest to themselves and to the Caliph. Okay. Okay, another thing about Mamun is that he was among very few who had total equality of the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims. And he was absolute toleration. If some other ones were, promoting Islam over others, if they still had some kind of a disqualification for the non-Muslims, he was the one who welcomed all faiths in his court. So again, if you contrast it to the Europeans, I don't know any European court until the 19th century where the Jews and the Muslims were welcome and were equally debating issues of philosophy and religion and science next to somebody else from another religion. Moreover, if they suspected you were a heretic, as they would call them, a Jew or a Muslim, they'll kill you all the way into the 19th century. So this was extraordinary, that here at this brightest court of all courts of the time, you had total equality of religions, and they were guided pretty much by the principle of Al-Kindi, and that is that wherever the truth is, nothing is more important than the truth, and it could come from any quarters, including from non-Muslims. But religious affairs. During Mamun's times, there was a very interesting debate among the Muslims, and it's an extraordinary period that would continue with his son too, but it's an extraordinary period in Islamic theology. The reason it's so important is that it had consequences, but also it shows that the degree of toleration was such that this was the period when you could have a public debate not only on the meaning of the truth, not only on the meaning of scientific matters, medicine, but on the meaning of Islam. And so the question that was debated at Mamun's times was raised by one of the scholars, and they were later called Mutazilites. Mutazilites is a teaching that rose out of a simple question. And the question was, what is the origin of Quran? Now, a lot of people think it's a very easy question to answer, but most people get into this trap. It's not so easy, because they were provided two answers. One answer is that Quran appeared from Muhammad in Arabic language, and it is the word of God, but it comes from Muhammad through his verbalization of this. Now, that means that the implication of that reasoning is that there was a time when there was no Quran. Before Muhammad, there was no Quran. There was a time when there was no Arabic language. There was a time when there were no Arabs. There was a time when the Arabs and the Jews were one. So there were all kinds of times, and it suggests a kind of a historical perspective that the time comes and then the word of God is verbalized by Muhammad. Now, other people who were more like orthodox or more strict or more conservative, if you want, their answer to this question was Quran existed forever. And it was just that it was verbalized by Muhammad, but it's the word of God, and therefore God is eternal, therefore Quran is eternal too, and it always was there. And that interpretation suggested that you cannot interpret Quran. Now, if you think that Quran is a product of time and space, you could have interpretation of the meaning. But if you think it's the word of God, you're more likely to be among those who say you can't interpret anything because you cannot argue with God. And therefore, this is it. Now, if there are places in Quran that are not clear, you still have to figure out what it means. But they would say, no, we know how it is and nobody else. So it actually created a dispute that very quickly got out of hand. And at this time, it's the Mutazilites who said Quran appeared in time and place. And Mamun actually supported the Mutazilites. And his son did. And his grandson didn't. But the amazing thing is, it is during these times that the most interesting and fascinating debates on the meaning of Quran appeared. And when those won, who said there's nothing to discuss, it's all a word of God, and the rest of it you can't touch, this is when it all ended. There was no more, for centuries, discussion of the meaning of Quran, and in a sense, in my point of view, it did damage to Islam as a theology, as something that's a living and developing and has arguments, because arguments are good. It is in the arguments that you have life and that you have development and change. So, another problem was that as these debates grew more acrimonious, Mamun sided with those who were Mutazilites, and at the end of his life he kind of went to extreme measures, which basically there was, he insisted that the Mutazilite position is the correct one, and he required of members of the government to pledge allegiance and to publicly say that they support the Mutazilite interpretation of Quran, which other people who didn't think so thought it was repressive, and they were against it, and they were pretty much upset, and some people refused, and they were imprisoned, and basically it got out of hand to a point of some kind of a religious dispute that generated repressions. That's what it was. Another thing that Mamun had to face is that there were, in 817, there were rebellions brewing up in the provinces. And in 1817, he designated a successor to himself, whose name was Ali al-Rida. Ali al-Rida was a Shia, and he was an imam who was of the bloodline of Ali, the founder of Shia. And that really created a stir in Baghdad and a rebellion against Mamun. He actually had to fight for his life because it was so unheard of that he would choose the heir who was a Shia. Now, for him, it wasn't a Shia. He just basically felt, well, this is the descendants of Muhammad, so what's the big deal? It didn't take it seriously. He was much more rational and much less committed to any kind of stereotypes in response. In any case, there was a revolt, and his brother his uncle was proclaimed the Caliph, and he had to fight another war. He had to go to Baghdad and reconquer it, and this is what he did in the end. In 830, he had another war with Byzantium, which was ongoing. They had pretty much in every rule they had a war with the Greeks, with changing success. Most of the time they were winning, but occasionally the Greeks would win, as we would hear in the next reign. But in this military campaign, he got sick and died, also at the age of 45. So let me identify several problems that you could see in his reign that would actually cripple the Abbasid dynasty and would lead to the decline of this dynasty, and unfortunately also to the decline of the Golden Age. So the first one I call the governor problem. The governor problem is that when they appoint a governor, the governor has a son, and a lot of times the governor would pass the governorship to his son, and that creates a kind of a dynasty. People, after decades in power, they get used to the idea that they rule this territory, and it would be very, very difficult to dislodge them and appoint somebody else. So the governor problem, as you know, I think began at the time of Ali with Muawiyah, when the governor for the first time refused to step down. Now it becomes a serious problem because you have governors in Khorasan, which is in northern Iran, you have governors in Egypt, and they kind of begin to act as if they're independent. They still send money to Baghdad, but that's about it. In everything else, they begin to rule more on their own. So the governor problem is one. The second problem, which probably is the first problem, is the brothers problem. Virtually in every generation, you have two brothers. And since there's no clear-cut rule who is going to be the next caliph, there's no clear-cut rule like in Europe where all the son gets to be. It is the worthy one, and it is the one that the preceding caliph appoints. And then they swear on Quran, and then they violate their oath, and then there's a war. So the war between the brothers is going to be a big problem in generations to come. The third problem, I call it the vizier problem. The vizier problem first showed up at the time of Yahya Bar Makir, who actually had more power than Harun Rashid. But at that time, Harun Rashid could fire him. He did. He fired him. He confiscated all his property. So the caliph was stronger than the vizier. What is going to happen in the successors of Mamun is that the viziers got to be stronger than the caliph, because the viziers had been in power a long time. They had connections, they knew the instruments of power, and the caliphs were boys, they were kids, they had no idea how to run anything, and it would be the vizier in the long term who would pick who is going to be the caliph of the brothers. And since he would pick them, and the caliphs would be young boys, and versus the experienced governor, the experienced prime minister, it would be the prime ministers who would actually win. And it would turn out to a situation that the real rulers of the caliphate were not the caliphs, but the viziers. So that's the vizier problem. And finally, the fourth problem is the hired army. Essentially, after Mamun, and the caliphs began to rely more and more on the foreign army, specifically the Turks. At first, because the Turks were good fighters, but also because they're convenient, because they could be relied upon to crush the rebellion in among your people. So, if you have a war with your brother, the Turks have no stake in it. In fact, the only stake they have is that you win, because then they would be rewarded. Now, whereas the loyalty of Arabs and other locals is questionable, because who knows whose side they're going to take. And therefore, they started to rely increasingly on the hired army, which is extremely dangerous, as is all well known from the Roman Empire, the Praetorian Guard, which basically picked up whose emperor to support, and then they would crush the preceding emperor and establish their own. So that is what's going to happen in the Abbasid Caliphate. The army would back whoever the vizier wants, and it would lead to a situation that the caliphs would have no power at all. So these are the problems, and in the coming lecture we will discuss the two other followers after Mamun, how these problems played out, and that would explain the slow decline of the Abbasid Caliphate.